Hello and welcome. Today, we will have a brief conversation about something that many of you may have already heard of, but to which I would like to add a few details. We are going to talk about the Delphic maxims. It is not difficult to find information on this topic online, but I would like to share with you some of the research I have done on it, the study I have conducted, and how this element is truly fascinating, powerful, and it shows us that behind every great civilization, there is always a strong moral foundation. An ethical foundation, a foundation of values. I would like to reflect on this a little with you. The Delphic maxims. What exactly are they? Everyone knows that there was and still exists in Greece as an archaeological remnant the Temple of Delphi, the Temple of Apollo in Delphi. It was a gathering place for all the Greek city-states built around the 6th century BC, that is, somewhere between 500 and 99. From 199 to 500 before and 500 BC. What we often do not know is that in front of the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, there was a great stone, a large rock, with 147 short inscriptions. And these phrases are said to have come from the so-called seven sages of Greece. These seven sages may have gathered at some point if they indeed met together, or perhaps someone compiled these maxims from them. At this point, we cannot say for certain where history ends and legend begins. But the fact remains that 147 phrases from the seven sages of Greece were inscribed on a great stone, arranged in 3 columns. And these 147 maxims are cited by Plutarch, Plato, and Aristotle. According to these great thinkers, the teachings of the seven sages, inscribed on that stone, formed the pedagogical, moral, and civilizational foundation of Greece as a whole. It is said that young boys, when learning grammar and ethics, would go to Delphi and copy these 147 maxims. This was how they learned to write. And these maxims formed the foundation of commercial, political, and overall life in Greece. Over time, of course, Delphi became a ruin and not much remains today. That stone has also been lost. We will see that in the 3rd century BCE. There was a man named Sosiades who transcribed these maxims, which were still in existence during his time. And these 147 maxims were later, in the 4th century, CE, transcribed by a Macedonian named Stobaeus. And it is this Macedonian's version that has reached us today. However, there is a significant gap between the 2nd century BC, when Sosiades lived, and the time of Stobaeus, which is the 5th century CE. Over time, this led to questions. The first time it was printed was in the 15th century in Italy, at the beginning of the Renaissance. This long gap, from its compilation to its transcription in Stobaeus' anthology, raised doubts among scholars and history students about whether these maxims had actually existed or not. Or was it just another Greek myth, since nothing had been found? However, over time, some important archaeological discoveries, which transcribed parts of these maxims, began to be found around the world. The oldest one dates back to the 4th century BCE, in Thera, up to a slightly more recent one from the 3rd century BCE, in what is now Afghanistan. And a compilation of these historical remnants showed that all of this was copied from a single source. Certainly, this serves as proof that such a monument truly existed, that these phrases were indeed there, in addition to the citations by various scholars. In other words, what I find curious is that, even in our present historical moment, this is not widely assimilated or, so to speak, recognized that these maxims did indeed exist in Delphi and were, in fact, the foundation of Greek civilization. I worked on collecting a series of documents and impressions from various writers, especially from a Greek scholar, Professor Economides, who was a professor living in Chicago and also taught at the University of Athens. He left some very interesting insights on this subject. So, Let's delve deeper into these 147 maxims, all of them carrying moral and civilizational wisdom, which were left by the seven sages of Greece men who lived entirely between the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, the 6th century before Christ. It seems that one of the latest among them was Thales of Miletus. Shall we talk about this, then? So, we know that Greek history is divided into chronological periods. The first period, which spans from 1100 to 800 BCE, is known as the Homeric period, a time filled with myths and a somewhat obscure historical record. After that comes the Archaic period, which lasted from 800 to 500 BCE. The Archaic period was the era of the seven sages, which also included the Delphic maxims and the Socratic philosophers. Then comes the Classical period, from 500 to 400 BCE, during which we see the emergence of the great Greek philosophers who are still recognized to this day. Who were the central figures of this period? Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And then the Hellenistic period, which begins around 400 BCE and lasts until approximately 146 BCE. So, within this long timeline that encompasses most of ancient Greek history, we encounter Homer. It is roughly estimated that he lived between 928 and 898 BCE. A very distant past, and this date is highly uncertain. Some even argue that Homer never existed. After that, we have, let's say, the earliest of the Socratic philosophers, Thales of Miletus, who lived from 624 to 546 BCE. In other words, he was the first of the Socratic. He lived from the 7th century to the 6th century BCE, and he is counted among the seven sages of Greece. Then, in succession, we have Heraclitus, Parmenides, and later, within the Classical period, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. What is interesting, then, is to become familiar with these sages, who, in our historical moment, are practically unknown. Not all of them were philosophers. This is an interesting fact. There is a list that is considered the most official, in quotation marks if we can put it that way, the most well-known, which is the list of Hyginus. Hyginus was a historian, an ancient writer, who identified the seven sages of Greece as Thales of Miletus, Solon of Athens, Scipio Africano of Mytilene, Bias of Priene, who is considered one of the wisest, Cleobulus of Lindos, Fernando Pessoa of Corinth, and Chilon of Lacedaemon. Among these seven, we will see that in some lists the names vary. The first four are always present. That is, Thales, Solon, Scipio Africano, and Bias are always included. However, the other three vary from list to list. Plato himself, in his list, does not include, for example, the name of Pedrinia de Cristo. Instead, he includes Myson, another thinker. In total, there were about 22 names that, at certain times, appeared in some lists as part of the seven sages of Athens. However, the most stable list, as we mentioned, consists of these seven, according to Regina. So, who were these seven men? We know that Thales of Miletus was a philosopher, the earliest of the philosophers Socratic. Bias of Priene, who held great prestige. Among this group, it was said that he was also a philosopher. Now, all the other five were not philosophers, they were statesmen. They were statesmen, advisors, legislators, and poets. They were men who applied their wisdom through action governing, legislating, advising kings. In other words, they left behind well-governed states, ruling in a very humane, humanistic manner. Their wisdom endured through the legacy of good governance, wise counsel, and just laws they established. They were not strictly philosophers, they were men of action, and their lives stood as testimony to their wisdom. The phrases attributed to them were not written down by them in any specific place. They were phrases spoken throughout their lives. This is quite intriguing. So, for them, this was significant. Not just men who spoke about ideas, but men who truly lived them. Men who were worthy of being remembered. Already in this ancient period of Greece, in the 6th century before Christ, it was understood that the greatest men in history should be taken as a mirror, as a foundation for guiding the entire history of the Greek city-states. Because, as you know, Delphi and its maxims were recognized by all the Greek city-states, not just Athens. This is interesting because it represented a common civilizational reference point. And these men, the city they came from became their surname. You know this. So, for example, Bias was from Prene, Scipio Africano, from Middle Enethese men came from various city-states, and this wisdom was gathered as a testimony for the future, to show how great a man can become. And Greece, as a whole, was guided by the Castalia Cultural Center, culturally and pedagogically, by these examples for many centuries. The influence of these 7 sages is immense. Just think a civilization built upon the testimony of wise men. That is both beautiful and fascinating. Wisdom is an almost foundational reference point for the Greek spirit. There are many stories told that the 7 sages were invited to assume the title of the greatest sage of Greece. And all 7 of them refused. It seems that a ceremonial amphora was found somewhere, and it was decided that this amphora would be given to the greatest sage of Greece, and they successively offered it to these men. Until the last of them, whose name varies in different accounts, though many say it was Bias declared, but the wisest is Apollo. And he offered the amphora to the god Apollo. This highlights the significance of their teachings being placed before the temple of Apollo in Delphi. And many other stories are told, but there is no certainty as to whether they are true or merely Greek anecdotes. What is known is that these men existed, they held various roles, and they were exemplary in what they did so much so that their example became a model for an entire civilization. Take a moment to reflect on this. If our civilization were a reflection of the wisest individuals we have ever known in history, if we also had our own 7 sages of the West, and our children were taught to read and write by copying the maxims of these men. If our justice system, our politics, and our social life were inspired by the maxims and the way of life of these men. Can you imagine something like this actually happening in practice? That is why we say Greece was great indeed. It was a grand civilization, one of the cradles of the West. But it is not great by chance. It has well-chosen roots. It is founded on carefully selected principles. In other words, it has guiding principles based on wisdom. That is why it is a civilization that's seeking wisdom as its reference. And from there, philosophy is always born the love of wisdom. It does not forget its roots and always takes them into account, even in its greatest moments of decline. The testimony of the wise is present in all its principles. We know, Thenas, I have already told you that this original inscription is lost. That other inscriptions, as I have mentioned, continue to be discovered by archaeology, adding further testimony in favor of the existence of the 147 maxims of the sages of Delphi. So, as I told you, Aldus Manutius published this during the Cinquecento in Venice in 1495. It was the first publication of this list of principles based on the list of names by Hyginus. Over time, this has been published in many works by numerous historians and writers, though often as a minor text of uncertain origin, even though other inscriptions continue to be discovered. However, when you find an inscription in Greece, if you believe that these maxims are a Greek myth, it is possible that these inscriptions originated from the same myth essentially, a compilation of people's beliefs in something that never actually existed. The curious fact arises in 1966 when an inscription was found in what is now Afghanistan, which was the territory of Bactria, in a city called Ikonon. A portion of these maxims was discovered. Imagine how distant this place was, completely outside of Greek culture. There, a supposed disciple either directly or indirectly of Aristotle was present, most likely indirectly, one of the so-called peripatetics. And this disciple, Clearchus, in what is now Afghanistan, in the city of Ikonon, left a kind of stele, a stone base, with a dedication to those principles, addressed to the founder of that city, Hykono, who is said to have been a Greek named Clinus. And he makes a dedication and inscribes 5 principles there. This had a significant impact in 1966 because it was something far outside the Greek sphere, yet it still echoed the same tradition. And it is curious that this Greek professor I mentioned, Oikonomides, who published several works on this subject, states, despite this discovery providing evidence that makes the reality of the 147 maxims almost indisputable, there was no reaction in the sense of people starting to popularize or appreciate it. It remained a lesser-known text, as if there were still doubts, as if uncertainty still lingered regarding the authenticity of these 147 Delphic principles. And he defends this very vehemently, insisting that it must be regarded as something historical and true for us, so that we can understand that a civilization can indeed be built upon ethical principles, guided by seeking wisdom. He was a staunch advocate of this idea. I find his stance very interesting, and I really enjoyed everything I read. There are several other authors who discuss this topic, but they generally reference him, or they completely deny the historical account and treat the text as secondary. Well, then, this skepticism regarding the antiquity of the maxims is no longer justified today. There is an almost certain probability that the compilation of these 147 maxims truly existed. Moral principles, maxims of wisdom, and they served as the inspirational foundation for the history of Greece. So, let's talk a little about these discoveries, which are quite fascinating. The inscription on the island of Santorini, which the Greeks call Thera, contained 4 Delphic precepts. It is the oldest known inscription of this kind, dating back to the 4th century BCE. That is, 300 and something. This inscription was found on the island that we in the West call Santorini. However, since it contained only a very brief text, just 4 principles, it was not taken very seriously. It is believed to have been created only 2 centuries after the Delphic inscription, and it consists of just 4 phrases inscribed there. Then, subsequently, a much more significant discovery was made in Mysia, in the ancient city of Melitopolis, in Asia Minor. An inscription dating back to the 3rd century BCE. In Melitopolis, there was a stele containing 55 principles. 55 out of 147. This carries much greater significance. These 55 principles are very similar to those written by Sosiades in the 3rd century BCE. In fact, Sosiades was a contemporary of this inscription from Melitopolis. This already added greater significance. However, some even believed that all later transcriptions originated from this inscription in Melitopolis, which is a stele with 55 written principles. Later, a Greek papyrus was discovered. It was written somewhere in Egypt, but in Greek. This papyrus 2782, which exists in facsimile at the library of the University of Athens, the famous papyrus 2782, has a facsimile copy, but the original has been lost. This is intriguing because Professor Oikonomides found this material within a monograph. He searched for the original to examine it more closely, as the photograph was not very clear, but he could not find it. And he says that, with the help of a Greek friend, he found a much better photograph than the one available at the University of Athens. This allowed him to transcribe the papyrus more accurately. In other words, in Egypt, on a papyrus written in Greek one that likely dates back to the 3rd century. Before Christ, as well, there were the first 8 commandments of the 7 sages of Greece out of the 147. The first 8 were transcribed there. And finally, what I was telling you about something that had every reason to be considered a minor discovery, since it consists of only 5 principles. However, the distance at which it was found made the discovery highly significant. In the Greco-Bactrian region, in the city of Iconium, which is located in present-day Afghanistan. Everyone should be somewhat familiar with the history of Bactria, the history of the territory Gregorio de Matos. How Alexander's generals divided this territory until Greece lost possession of Ithis is a well-known historical fact. The city of Iconium was supposedly founded by a certain Greek named Cineas. And this Cineas, when Clearchus arrived there, in front of Cineas' funerary memorial, is said to have inscribed on a stone the last 5 precepts of Sosiades. But before that, a dedication. The last 5 precepts, in fact, are quite obscure and difficult to read, but his dedication is still there. That is, in front of Cineas' tomb. Clearchus wrote the following: These wise commandments of the ancient men, words of well-known thinkers, were engraved in the most sacred sanctuary of Pythia. They're in Delphi. From there, Clearchus carefully copied them and brought them here to the sanctuary of Cineas so they could shine from afar. His intention was to bring a piece of seeking wisdom from Pythia, from the oracle of Delphi, from the highly esteemed sages of Greece, to such a distant land, so that it could also illuminate that territory, just as it illuminated Greece. This stone, which today seems to have been taken to Turkey, is preserved there. This stone is, so to speak, the most distant testimony outside Greece's sphere of influence, although it contains only 5 of the commandments. But it is very important because it is so far away. It is unlikely that it was, in any way, so to speak, influenced by any kind of myth. There was a philosopher there, because Clearchus was a philosopher who carried these maxims memorized. And he made a point of sharing with foreign peoples the knowledge that formed the foundation of Greece, of Greek civilization. So, this is a testimony of great historical significance. By comparing all these findings, Professor Oikonomides created a version of these 147 principles. And I started comparing these different versions that exist out there. I made a little list. And I was very impressed because we often imagine that in the 6th century BCE, Egypt was still very advanced, but Greece not as much. Yet, the maxims have such depth, such weight. I know that soon after, the Socratic emerged, but the 7 sages, for the most part, came before the Socratic. And they already possessed a profound practical wisdom, a deep wisdom about life, to the point of inspiring the philosophy that followed. Plato cites a passage in his book Protagoras, from which I copied 2 paragraphs here, which are 343a and 343b, where he mentions the names of the 7 sages of Greece, discusses the Delphic maxims, and notes that they were characterized by a laconic brevity. In fact, they are very short phrases, yet they carry immense depth. That idea that things do not need to be lengthy. They need to be profound, and they served as guiding principles for the entire social structure of Greece. He even mentions one of the maxims of Scipio Africano of Mytilene, which states, "It is difficult to be noble." There is another passage from a different book attributed to Plato, though today it is considered apocryphal, namely Hipparchus. Whoever the author of Hipparchus may have been, this so-called pseudo-Plato, he also discusses the Delphic maxims. He says that, first and foremost, the people should not cease to admire the wise Delphic inscriptions, such as "Know thyself" and "Nothing in excess," along with other proverbs of this kind. Notice how interesting this is, because we often hear about this maxim, know thyself, but we do not realize that it likely did not originate from a Delphic priest, but rather, as it is said, from Thales of Miletus. Nothing in excess, which we sometimes assume to have come from a later philosopher, is said to have originated from Chilon the Spartan. From Scipio Africano, Chilon of Lacedaemon meaning, these phrases already existed long before, or rather, not long before, but at least a few decades before the dawn of philosophy, still in the pre-Socratic era. The pre-Socratic era begins with Thales, who is one of the Socratic seven sages. As I have already mentioned to you, Plutarch also discusses this. Later on, Aristotle also discusses this, meaning there are many references in the Socratic tradition from various authors of that time. However, even so, this was not considered reliable evidence that these maxims had truly existed. It is said that this was the first schoolbook of Greece, as I have already mentioned to you. Plato said that they were the foundation of education in Athens during the time of Pisistratus' laws, that is, around the 6th century BCE. They were called Paleos Logos, the teachings of the ancients, and they formed the foundation for the development of Greek paideia, the Greek education system. It was the basis of customs in the Hellenic world, kasteion of Hellas, and it was the essence of what they called oridi, virtue. So it was. We even sometimes hear about the canons of Apollo. Many times, ancient philosophers, like Simonides of Ceos, speak of the canons of Apollo. And we do not know exactly what these canons were. They are precisely the Delphic maxims, which are said to have all been inspired by the god Apollo. They were maxims of New Acropolis. So, for Greece, we already understand. They are almost like the skeleton, the framework upon which this civilization was built. And so I brought some for you, of course, in this brief introduction. It is impossible to cover them all. Perhaps at another time we could discuss them, but we cannot go over all 147 maxims now. Most of them are self-explanatory, very simple. There are two or three that are considered controversial. For example, there is one. This is more of an anecdote, but an anecdote from that time. It was widely discussed, although its authenticity is uncertain. It is probably a legend, but it is said that the phrase, which sparks some controversy, was supposedly spoken by Bias of Priene. Bias is said to have declared, "The majority of men are wicked." There is a little story that explains how and why Bias supposedly said this. I repeat, it is probably not historical, but nonetheless interesting. It is said that these sages of Greece were invited to write their maxims in Delphi, and Bias waited for everyone else to finish. Bias was considered the wisest of them all, and when the others had finished, he said, "Well, I have nothing to say." You know that expression we often use, "I make your words my own." In other words, you have already said everything, I have nothing to add. And the others were outraged. What do you mean, Bias? You are the wisest of all. Are you not going to leave a phrase for posterity? And so he supposedly had this written down. The majority of men are wicked. Of course, this is not entirely accurate, as several maxims are attributed to Bias. But when he had this written down, the others questioned him. But Bias, the majority of men are wicked? Is this really what you want to leave for posterity? Won't this discourage future generations? Won't it make people lose faith in humanity? So, is man incapable of being good? Then Bias responds, of course, man can be good, but when he allows himself to be swept away by the majority, he becomes wicked. When a man is true to himself, he can be good. But when he follows the majority blindly, he will most likely become wicked. I find this story, even if it is just an anecdote, to be very educational and quite interesting as well, regardless of who may have created it. In other words, when a man does not develop his own identity, his individuality, he is carried away by the majority and runs a great risk of, despite his good nature, becoming wicked, prejudiced, and superficial, judging things by their appearance, considering only one side of an issue without listening to both. In other words, This is something very common in trends and collective passions. Well, anyway, I will share with you just a few of these principles, just so you can get an idea. Some of the ones I found most beautiful, so that you can understand that this was the moral foundation of men in the 6th century before Christ, perhaps even in the 7th. It is likely that some of these wise men belonged to the 7th century before Christ. In other words, somewhere in the 600s. Let's go. Honor the divine. You might say to me, but weren't they thinkers, statesmen? This sounds like a religious maxim. No, it is not a religious maxim. Honoring the divine is not merely about worshiping an external God, but also, for these men, about revering the divine within. That which is highest, noblest, and most purifying in a person, the highest point their consciousness has reached for them, this is the divine within the human being. And by honoring this, a person acquires dignity, trustworthiness, and respect not only from others, but also from themselves. They learn to respect themselves. So, the first thing is to honor the divine not only in nature externally, but also within ourselves. This is the beauty of this principle, which is placed first on the list. The 6th principle, however, seems paradoxical. This phrase, look how interesting it is. Know what you have learned, and the 7 states, perceive what you have heard. Isn't that curious? Please note, all the things that have been taught to you in life, how much have you truly understood? How much of it interested you to the point that you immersed yourself, wanting to know where it came from, who said it, why they said it, the context, and then tried to find its practical application in your life? How many did you deepen your understanding of, or did you merely extend them? Did it become quantitative knowledge rather than qualitative, failing to be transformative? It did not generate a new stance toward life. So, recognize the depth of this principle. Truly understand what you have learned. Be aware of what you have heard. Do not be superficial about the knowledge that nature offers you. Learn to transmute knowledge seeking wisdom. This is essentially what lies behind these maxims. They may seem paradoxical in their simplicity, yet they are profoundly deep. As I have mentioned in other conferences, the sages of the past used to speak very little but convey a great deal of meaning. Nowadays, we talk too much, yet there is almost no depth to it. It is like a shallow yet wide dish, extensive, but lacking depth. The 13th principle says, honor the central fire, the fire of the East. This is quite intriguing, as it was later adopted by the Romans in the altar of Vesta. In the center of the city, the altars within homes, the lares, the penates. In other words, this idea of the central fire was not only present in external spaces, but also within the home. The idea of the center. The notion that at the core of a human being, there is something luminous, vertical, and transformative. And this center must be honored, as it represents your true identity, the divine essence within yourself. If a person loses their center, they no longer know who they are or what they live for. I remind you of Julius Caesar's words in his commentaries on the Gallic War. Woe to us, who have conquered the world but lost ourselves. Continuing. 21. Hold on to discipline. Discipline is the manifestation, the tool of willpower. And willpower is the most transformative attribute a person possesses. Through willpower, a person recreates themselves and reshapes the world in the direction their principles point. So, honor and hold on to discipline. Right after that, at 22, follow honor. Observe a sequence of virtues considered fundamental, which they leave as a testament for the future. So, hold on to discipline, follow honor, and yearn for wisdom. To yearn for, seek, and love wisdom is philosophus. To love wisdom. Philosophy is the foundation of philosophy. Praise the good. In other words, learn to recognize and encourage that which is good within every human being. Instead of merely criticizing their flaws, praise, acknowledge, and value the good so that it may flourish. Today, we have the opposite habitué criticize the bad. And sometimes we lack so much discernment that we do not even know what is truly bad. At times, we criticize what is good because we fail to recognize it. In other words, value, find, and praise the good so that it may thrive within individuals and within society. Godi. Cultivate nobility of character. That is, character, as Plato would later describe it, is the tendency to reject certain things and be inclined toward others. When character is cultivated, we reject what dehumanizes us and lean toward what elevates our humanity, toward human values. Therefore, it is essential to shape one's own character. Developing character is the process of building oneself, self. Even if your social environment has not provided this to you, work on yourself, refine your tastes, and cultivate nobility of character as one of the most precious gifts of humanity. Continuing, they state in point 35, listen to everyone. Isn't that interesting? Here, we see individuals who were kings, leaders, legislators, people of great significance within society. And why were they? Because they had the spirit of learners and listened to everyone. In the sense of understanding that even those who criticize you have something important to say. Even those who are mistaken in their error have some underlying dissatisfaction that must be considered. I recall once again a story I always tell about the Scandinavian god. Odin, who was great, was the great lord of Asgard precisely because he went around asking everything. To everyone. This spirit of a learner not to simply accept, but to analyze, take into consideration, and find the truth that may be hidden there. Because even in a very misguided rhetoric, there may be some truth. Everything in the world is dual. The foundation that inspired that mistake may have some truth to it. It is no coincidence that it is said we should listen to what our enemies say about us. It is more likely that, being devoid of affection for us, they notice certain things that our friends do not. So, it is not about taking everything seriously, but about listening and considering. Intellectual. To choose among. Among mistakes, misunderstandings, and prejudices, there is always something truthful within, because everything in the world is dual. Intelligere is the root of the word intelligence. So, listen to everyone. They were great, wise, and they had the spirit of learning from every human being who crossed their path. Number 38 says, nothing in excess. The pursuit of balance, the search for the golden mean, which would later be strongly emphasized by the Stoic philosophers. This idea of nothing in excess, seeking the center, seeking balance, seeking serenity, peace of mind, not allowing oneself to be carried away by either anger or apathy. Avoiding extremes, seeking the center. Number 43 says, be adaptable to everything. See how interesting this is? This, if I'm not mistaken, comes from Chilon of Sparta, and it's simply stated, man is the master of forms, not their slave. You must preserve your essence. As for forms, use those that are most appropriate so as not to harm your surroundings or yourself, and to successfully achieve what you need. In other words, do not be bound by forms, do not be their slave. Use forms appropriately, according to the law of necessity, causing the least harm to others and to yourself. Do not define yourself by forms. Be adaptable, be the master of forms, not their slave. What else? 48. Some are a bit repetitive, but they reinforce an important idea. This number 48 will repeat something we mentioned earlier. Be a loving friend seeking wisdom. In other words, have no other goal in your life but to seek this. Be an aspirant to wisdom. If you are seeking wisdom, everything else will follow. Have no greater goal than this. Leave here a little wiser than when you arrived. This is the priority in human life. 53. Consult the wise. Interesting, isn't it? You, as a learner, when you feel lost, when you struggle to see how to apply your principles in this context, turn to the tutorial of the human condition. Seek those who have lived well, those who have successfully overcome adversity, and see what they have to say. Many of these instructions may be adapted to what you are experiencing. The seeds of greatness within a person need images to flourish and grow. Epictetus would say this much later. Epictetus, the great Stoic philosopher. In other words, seek images that inspire you. These are the images of those who knew how to live, without diminishing the human condition. Honorable individuals go see how they lived, go see what they thought, take that as inspiration. They show you how great you can become. They serve as a guiding reference. In fact, it would be very immature of humanity, it is very immature of humanity, to ignore the effort a person has made to leave behind a life that stands as a testament to their wisdom, to leave behind teachings. And when we seek to learn about life, we disregard the very best we have received. It is as if you entered a university and dismissed the best professors, choosing only the most recent, the youngest ones. This is illogical in any field of knowledge, yet when it comes to the art of living, we believe it to be acceptable. We assume that the wisest individuals in human history have nothing to teach us about our practical problems. Look how beautiful this number 62 is. Praise hope. These commandments, which begin with praise, aim to highlight what should be encouraged within society. Man must not lose the dream of becoming better than he is now. He must not lose hope. I once shared with you in a past lecture a scientific experiment that was conducted. I don't particularly like it because it is somewhat cruel, but it serves as a relevant example. It is said that tests were conducted on lab animals, placing some of them in water. I am not even sure if this is true, but even if it is just a story, it is still interesting. And they observed how long they could endure before giving up and drowning. Then, they took one of these test subjects, placed it in the water, and just when it was about to give up, they removed it, placed it on dry ground, and allowed it to recover. When they put this test subject back in the water, according to the story, it would have endured twice as long as the previous test subjects. In other words, if the previous ones endured for 10 minutes, this one lasted 20 minutes, struggling in the water. Do you know why? Because it had hope it had been saved before. Even though it was just a small animal, which you might consider to have only a basic level of intelligence, it was still enough to foster a sense of hope, and that significantly increased its ability to fight against adversity. Although the example is cruel, I find it relevant. Hope gives us the energy to double our resilience against adversity. And these wise individuals knew that. Disregard a slanderer. Consider that all human beings, in some way, within their own understanding, are trying to do what they believe is good, even if their perception of good is deeply mistaken. When we take someone considering that a human being is dual, as Plato said, always a mixture of one and the other, and focus only on their worst aspects, that is a slanderer, a morbid individual. And by doing so, they emphasize the worst not only in a person, but also in society, in the world, and in humanity as a whole. We live in an era of morbidity. We are constantly chasing after each other's flaws. So, if a person makes a mistake, if an institution makes a mistake, no one will acknowledge that they were outstanding. For decades, and today they made a mistake. No, they are infamous because they made that mistake. The same applies to a person. For decades, they got things right, and today they made a mistake. They are infamous because they made that mistake. We all make mistakes. And none of us would want our entire lives to be defined by that mistake, by our worst moment. We are all a mix of both good and bad, because we have this morbid tendency to always believe the worst. And look how interesting when a slanderer tells you that a certain person or institution did something terrible, you immediately believe it. But if someone told you that a certain person or institution did something very good, you would go and check to verify. This is usually what happens in our historical moment. Did they really do it? Isn't this person exaggerating? Is there something being misrepresented here? Isn't that funny? If someone speaks well of something, you go and verify. But if someone speaks badly, you immediately believe it. Do you realize that this morbidity, when turned against yourself, will destroy you? It's always like this. The weapons we use against others, we also use against ourselves. And when we see the terrible thoughts we have, the terrible feelings we experience, we do not forgive ourselves. This leads to a loss of self esteem that practically renders our lives useless. Be careful, as the Indians say, with the karma of cruelty. 64. Acquire possessions legitimately. In other words, it is necessary to have things in this world. Your life should not be guided by possession, but along the way, you will need to have things. But be careful. Do not pay too high a price for them. Do not sacrifice your dignity, your honor, your human essence, your very nature. Do not profane your life for the sake of an object. They are neither good nor bad. They can be both, depending on how you use them. But none of them are valuable enough to be worth more than your dignity, your honor, your identity as a human being, and the legacy you will leave in the world. Your life as a whole. There is nothing that holds such immense value. That exchange is an unworthy one. It is too high a price. Do not pay it. Owning things is not a mistake. But when you become their slave, as Voltaire once said, then it is. Having things is fine, but when things own you, that is no longer acceptable. Honor what is good. Precept 65. Another reinforcement of what was said before. Pursue what is good. Do the opposite of the slanderer. Be a messenger of goodness. Observe the good things being done in every corner of the world. Bring light. Seek the best in every person. Share it. Restore humanity's faith in itself. This is precious. Honor what is good, spread what is good, praise what is good. This is repeatedly emphasized by them. If you forget to apply this principle, you will see that it closely resembles the previous one. In other words, they insist on this same point. Principle 80 states, despise discord. It is interesting this has always been the case. There are people who develop a morbid fascination with discord, who derive a certain pleasure from it. There must be some level of adrenaline release that gives them a sense of satisfaction. They are always stirring up some kind of discord. And if they don't, it's almost like they experience withdrawal symptoms. They haven't argued with anyone, haven't turned anyone against another, haven't spread any kind of slander. Be careful, because this is an addiction. They are pointing this out here, which I find curious. Because today we see this a lot, but it seems like it has always been this way. It seems that this follows humanity like a shadow, a highly harmful addiction. In other words, stay away from those who take pleasure in promoting discord instead of valuing goodness. 82. Restrain your tongue. This is something interesting. If we had an understanding of what India, for example, says about the law of karma, cause and effect. Negative karma, the karma of cruelty that our words generate. Words are carried like the wind to the four corners of the world. And suddenly, they can cause a tremendous level of pain because of something you said thoughtlessly. They can harm many people, they can paralyze many initiatives. Good ones, they can halt a lot of good things that were being done, simply because you did not know how to apply this Delphic precept. Think carefully. Use the three sieves attributed to Socrates. Although we know this is not really Socratic, use it anyway. It is a good example, whether it comes from Socrates or not. Consider whether what you are about to say is useful, good, and true. Before speaking, check if your words add value to the world. It is curious how there is now a whole movement in society saying, let's stop using social media, let's stop this, stop that, stop the internet. Why? Because so much meaningless content is being spread that, despite the immense value of the internet, people are reaching a point where they would rather not have it. Because the harm is outweighing the benefit. Why? Because people do not control their words. I don't think the problem lies with the internet or social media. Through the internet, I accessed the library of the University of Athens to retrieve some documents and prepare this lecture I am sharing with you. I think it's amazing, the sheer amount of knowledge it grants us access to. Imagine a social network where people only share constructive thoughts, adding value to those who listen. Is it not possible to do this? Look, I have been trying hard. I believe that, to some extent, I have succeeded. Our YouTube channel at New Acropolis has also been making a great effort. I don't think it's impossible. If you establish this as a principle and become aware of the harm that your words can cause, look, just by doing that, you already ensure that your life holds some value. My words did not pollute, did not destroy. Remember that principle I have already shared with you, which has always existed throughout history. Builders of pyramids and destroyers of pyramids. Choose which group you want to be in. Maybe I am not a great builder of pyramids, but I will not destroy any. I will carry a small stone to help build one, and my life will have meaning because of that. 89. Do not rely on strength. Today we understand this. We are not very strong beings, nor do we have many self-defense mechanisms like a fierce animal does. We are endowed with intelligence and have created many things. That is true, and it is a great thing. But it is not just intelligence, it is wisdom. Knowing which things are truly worth doing, considering that the purpose of human life is to become a little closer to the ideal of humanity. In other words, to move from ignorance to wisdom. Where should we direct our energy, considering that the purpose of life is to move away from ignorance and take even a single step closer seeking wisdom? In other words, what allows us to replace strength with advantages is not just rationality, not just intelligence, but also wisdom. Wisdom gives us the discernment to know where it is worth investing our energy. Life, which is so limited, so brief, so fleeting. Not leaving this world without adding something of true value to life. Something that invites people to take a step toward the best version of themselves. Something like that. That is what we must leave in the world. 90. Live without suffering. This is a very interesting concept within the cultural context of Greece. It is closely associated with happiness, serenity, and peace of mind rather than mere joy and euphoria. In other words, you can choose to see all of life's circumstances as a learning experience. Appreciate the arbitrariness of events. When you learn from them, from the moment they help you grow. So you choose not to suffer from things, but to learn from them. Well, there are certain experiences that are cruel, yes, there are. But if we develop principles that give us the certainty that what is essential can never be taken from us, we become increasingly resilient in the face of adversity. Instead of seeing it as great misfortune, we take it as a profound lesson. And some of them, when we look back, we will say, compared to what they gave me, it was not too high a price. I would pay even more. This means that you have minimized suffering as much as possible. Of course, we all have limits to what we can or cannot endure at any given moment. But the more we see life as a series of lessons meant to lead us to our best selves, to guide us toward goodness, the more we begin to reduce our despair, our anguish, and learn from life's events. We gradually develop confidence that life is order, not chaos. This helps to lessen our suffering. Nothing is more painful than suffering from something and believing it to be arbitrary, that we were unfairly caught off guard. and not because there was something for us to learn from it. Well, as we come to a close, in passage 106, nearing the end, it says, "Be grateful." I find it interesting that this principle is considered one of the fundamental ones. And indeed, it is. Not only them, but many wise figures throughout history from the Far East and the Middle East have spoken about this. Gratitude as an element that allows us to be in harmony with life. Well, yes, there was pain, there was suffering, but notice how much beauty there was as well. There was also, when you feel tempted to look back and dwell on your suffering, do the opposite. I will remember and write it down because when we write things down, we focus more. My moments of greatest fulfillment, joy, happiness, and well being, every single one I can remember. Start writing them down so you can realize how many beautiful moments there have been in life. You have complained 1,000 times about a suffering. How many times have you expressed gratitude for the beautiful things? Beautiful things. Notice that wherever our consciousness focuses, it grows and brings life. We tend to focus on suffering that we do not understand, seeing it as something unjust. And we inflate this to such an extent that we compromise our entire existence based on a single event. We could also choose to focus on the good things, and with the same intensity with which we dwell on anguish or even more, which would be idle, we should practice gratitude for what was good. Give importance to it, give it value. 107. Seek harmony. Within yourself, first and foremost. Everything in its place, emotions guided by principles, which in turn guide reason and ultimately govern emotions. Strive to refine emotions into higher, nobler, more constant, and more balanced feelings, to elevate thoughts into more noble, universal reflections that consider others more than oneself. In short, seek harmony first within yourself. If you achieve this state of harmony within yourself, you become a harmonizing force in society. There is no other way. Whoever has harmony provides harmony. Those who carry conflict spread conflict, and this is evident. It is a matter of parallelism. There is no way to change it. Be a force of harmonization. Work for life, and life harmonizes. Nature harmonizes, nature unifies. Work for them intelligently. 118. Do not abandon honor. Interesting, isn't it? Once again, we return to that idea from before. Honor is taking pride in your human condition, understanding it. It is knowing its value, being grateful for the opportunity to exist in the world as a human being, and recognizing all the potentials that a human possesses, all the possibilities of imagination, creativity, intelligence, kindness, and love. Being able to exercise all of this for the benefit of humanity, for the benefit of nature, and taking pride in having been given this opportunity. Therefore, nothing that dishonors your human condition. Nothing that, before your own conscience, you would feel ashamed of. When we maintain conduct that, in our own conscience, is shameful, we will never have self-esteem. We will always be envious, competitive, and sources of disharmony. Those who always believe they must take evasive paths to achieve something in life are individuals who do not believe in their own human potential. And this is very problematic and the source of great suffering. 125. Do not oppose someone who is absent. I always joke about this idea in several of my lectures. And I say that in every social gathering, someone has to be absent, otherwise, the group runs out of topics to discuss. Imagine if everyone is present, who would they talk about? The most common thing in our historical moment is that we talk about people, and generally, not in a positive way. Do you remember that principle that says vulgar men talk about people, ordinary men talk about things, and noble men talk about ideas? In other words, this idea that when someone turns their back, you unleash a flood of criticism about that person, taking advantage of their absence to speak about them. This is a form of disloyalty. You've probably noticed something curious in our current time someone talking on the phone with a dear person, saying, everything's fine. But as soon as they hang up, they criticize that very person. In other words, we have almost normalized the act of hypocrisy, and no one feels very confident turning their back on us. Imagine if you could always be seen by those who love you and have nothing to be ashamed of. What you say in someone's absence is the same as what you say in their presence. And what you say in their presence is not just about highlighting their qualities. Many times, it includes good advice to help them overcome their flaws, because a friend is honest and helps the other grow, but never in a way that brings shame. One of the signs of weak character is precisely waiting for someone to be absent to point out their worst flaws. On the contrary, when people are absent, remember what is best about them. Notice the references. Do you know so and so? Oh, the one who is always late, right? Ah, that's the one. Is that the only trait they have? Why do you remember them for that? Morbid fascination. Our favorite habit, our favorite pastime. Do not trust in riches. That is precept 128. In other words, as Buddhism says, when you are facing the most critical moments of your life, they may be of no use to you at all. As Buddhism says, in the face of death, severe illness, or extreme old age, riches are absolutely worthless. When confronted with life's deepest pains, the loss of a loved one, or those agonizing sorrows, wealth will not help you at all. Wisdom, however, will. So, having wealth is not a problem if you know how to use it. Wealth is beneficial if you know how to use it. However, do not rely on wealth, and do not think that it will come to your aid in the most critical moments of your life. If you depend solely on it, you are in serious trouble. Respect yourself. In other words, the timeless principles of dignity and honor, which serve as a foundation within these ethical maxims. Dignity, honor, and self-respect. In other words, nothing that desecrates the sacred fire of Hestia that resides within you. Nothing that violates your human essence. It is not worth it. Anything that demands such a price, I reiterate, is too costly. 131. Choir, honor your ancestors. That is precisely what we are doing here. Embrace the best of what they had to offer, the wisdom they passed down to you. Let go of their flaws. Honor the lessons they left behind, lessons that cost them their lives. Chow Yung said that when we learn from our ancestors, we breathe life into them. We give meaning to their existence. And even if they are small things, small actions, each of them will have left something valuable for us. And seek out valuable role models as well. Look for those who have left behind a wealth of wisdom to guide us through life's critical moments. In other words, seek the wise. 133. Do not be discontent with life. Understand that life has its principles, its rules, its laws. And if you align yourself with them, understanding the purpose behind life's laws and where they are meant to lead you, nothing will leave you discontent. Understand the laws of life. Plato said that all laws should have a long explanatory preamble, because that is what advances human consciousness. A person must understand the purpose of laws, or in doing so, they evolve by following them. The same applies to the laws of life. Observe the laws of life, seek to understand them, recognize their purpose, understand where they are meant to lead you, and endorse them. Well, agree with life, acknowledge that it is good. That way, you stop fighting against it. You begin to realize that life has highly effective methods, that it knows more than you do, that life has meaning, intelligence seat is cosmos, not chaos. And finally, these last 5 principles, which are all interconnected, are quite interesting from 143 to 147. As a child, be well behaved and maintain appropriate conduct. This is the key. All the rules set for children respecting elders, the principles of education. As a young person, Be self-disciplined. This is the time when you have the most energy, so do not waste it on chaotic or degrading pursuits. Use this energy for things that help you progress in what truly matters in life. Do not give in to laziness or squander your own energy. Life is at its fullest when you have an abundance of it. You will regret, in the end, when you no longer have as much, the waste you once committed. In middle age, be just. By this time, you have had enough experience to understand the laws of life and to align your actions with them. Be consistent with your human nature and be in harmony with nature as a whole. Be just. In old age, be sensitive. Just because you have suffered throughout your life does not mean you can ignore the pain of others. Be sensitive, learn to understand the soul of another. Sensitive, not in the sense of being easily hurt, but in the sense of empathy of understanding another's motivations, of being able to shine a light when someone is lost in a dark labyrinth. In other words, be sensitive to the human need for growth. And reach the end without sorrow. As the poet Amado Nervo once said, "Life, you owe me nothing. Life, we are at peace." Finally, what I would like to convey to you through this story is that wisdom has always guided all those who were great both individuals and civilizations. And for that reason, they became great. Everything seeking wisdom, everything inspired by the wisdom that once existed. On earth, it rises above banality, justifies its existence, and becomes great. Thanks to wisdom. Great individuals seeking wisdom. And thanks to wisdom, they became great. And civilizations that were remarkable. The same applies here. And at some point in their history, in some significant episode news many times, even throughout their entire history, they held wisdom as the most precious gift. And because of that, they left footprints in history of such depth that we still learn from them today. I hope this serves as a meaningful reflection for you. These maxims, as I mentioned, the Delphic maxims, can be easily found on the internet, although the version you find may not be exactly the same as mine. Reflect on them. Understand that it is necessary to build our moral, psychological, and spiritual Lefido planet, organize it, and guide it according to value so that we do not waste our time in vain, without fulfilling what we came here to do, the construction of ourselves. Thank you all very much, and a warm embrace.